All right. I want to welcome everyone to our third digital dialogue for this fall. We've had an eventful series so far with some good speakers. Dr. Dan Williams kind of kicked things off, and then we had Elena Bennett 2 weeks ago. For those who are interested in following up on those talks, we have those posted on the Grassland 2.0 website, and the videos are on YouTube. I also want to provide a little background on the Grassland 2.0 project and the approach. The Grassland 2.0 project is centered around redesigning the agricultural system in a way that promotes water quality, builds soil health, and enhances rural communities. And we do this through our learning hubs and collaborative landscape design. And in that process, we prioritize bringing together a wide set of perspectives to inform land use decision making. And when I thought about that, I thought about a project I heard about a couple years ago with Dr. Mae Davenport, where they were bringing together a broad set of knowledge frameworks and perspectives to think about food sovereignty, land use decision making, and habitat. And I thought Mae would be a great person to bring in for a digital dialogue talk. Dr. Mae Davenport is a professor at the University of Minnesota, where she also completed her PhD in 2003. Mae, it's been kind of ironic. We've been bringing in a lot of Minnesota people. I know Dan Williams is also a U of M alum. And today she is the director of the Center for Changing Landscapes. Her research has a focus on human dimensions of natural resource management. She specifically focused on sustainable land use planning and community-based ecosystem management. Much of her research is interdisciplinary and seeks to integrate the biophysical and social sciences to better understand and address natural resource management problems. As I mentioned earlier, today she's working on a collaborative approach that centers around food sovereignty through cultural exchange and learning. Wild rice, also referred to as Manoomin or sin, holds a great deal of cultural, ecological, economic significance, yet the plant's range has been dramatically declining over the years. And to address this, Dr. Davenport, along with others, have been working on a research collaboration between tribes, intertribal organizations, nonprofit environmental organizations, and the University of Minnesota, with a core commitment towards tribal needs and wild rice stewardship. So I'm looking forward to having Dr. Davenport talk about that project. I also want to direct people, if they have questions, they can start to plug those into the chat or save them for the end. And we hope to have a dialogue there. With that, I will pass it off to Dr. Mae Davenport.
Thank you, John. I am going to share my screen. Let me know. Can you see my screen all right? The main.
Yes, we can see the main screen. That looks good.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, John, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to my presentation and to the University of Wisconsin Extension for inviting me to speak. I'm really excited to just share with you some of my perspectives, heavily influenced by the tribal partners and resource managers and collaborators that we've had, but to think about protecting Manoomin or Psiη and food sovereignty through cultural exchange, through a very dynamic and interdisciplinary research collaborative. So I think the plan is for me to speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we should have a good amount of time to for questions and just discussion at the end, so which I'm really looking forward to. Okay, so I think I will begin. Awesome. So I'm going to start with an introduction. My name is Mae Davenport. I grew up in the 1854 ceded territory, or Anishinaabe lands, which is now called northeastern Minnesota. My ancestors are of Western European descent, My grandparents first brought their family to this area on fishing trips in the 1950s. My parents fell in love with the woods and the waters here, and then they settled in the area in 1970. I now live in the Dakota Oyate, sacred lands of the Dakota peoples, in what is now called St. Paul. I'm a professor in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. And at the University of Minnesota, we recognize the land on which we live, learn, and work is the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous peoples. We are working at the University of Minnesota to improve and strengthen our relationships with the 11 sovereign tribal nations of present-day Minnesota. I'm also an environmental social scientist, and I shared my story of origin because I know how important narratives of people and places are, and that our origins and experiences shape our relationships with the world around us and the science that we do. All right. So I want to start with this overview of 3 lessons that I've learned over the last 5 or 6 years from Manoomin. And Manoomin is the Ojibwe name for wild rice. Psiη is the Dakota name. I want to acknowledge that. I'm going to primarily be using the name Manoomin because this work is reflective of the partnerships and collaboratives we have with the Ojibwe tribes that we're working with. So first and foremost, what I've learned is that Manoomin is a plant and a sacred relative under stress. There are lots of complex relationships and interactions that are important in understanding why Manoomin is under stress, and I'll talk about some of those. I've also learned that all relationships to Manoomin are important. Your relationship to Manoomin, my relationship, and the relationship of Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples throughout this region, kind of the Western Great Lakes region. All of those relationships are important. And then finally, in this talk, I'm gonna sort of share some lessons from Manoomin, because Manoomin teaches us about ourselves and about our relationships with other beings. And so that's kind of the framework for this presentation. And then I'll be talking about each of these in the subsequent slides. Okay. So many of you probably know that Manoomin is under stress. It's an aquatic grassland. It's an aquatic grass, a grain, and it's under stress. And it lives in shallow waters. And we know because of its under stress and because of its significance to tribes in the area that Indigenous peoples are particularly affected by the decline of wild rice. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit also about the story of the Anishinaabe and the migration from the St. Lawrence River Seaway way out on the East Coast towards and around the Great Lakes, and then into the states of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and of course up into the Canadian provinces. I think the best way to sort of convey the meaning of Manoomin to that migration is to read an excerpt in it's the health impact assessment led by the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Resource Management Division. It's a report that's available online. I'm gonna read word for word an excerpt from page 8. According to oral traditions, more than 1,000 years ago, 7 spirits or grandfathers came to the Anishinaabe people living on the Atlantic coast from the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, south into Maine and New England states. They delivered 7 prophecies, including the impending coming of the white race, which they believed would threaten their existence and separate them from their land, their culture, and their identity. In order to survive and preserve their ways of life, the Anishinaabe migrated westward through the Great Lakes Basin, guided by the prophecies that led them to the place where food grew up out of the water. That food was wild rice, or Manoomin, the good berry, the only grain native to North America. They found Manoomin growing in the waters and of tributaries, lakes, and coastal areas of Lake Superior, and established a new homeland there. Depending upon the harvest and preservation of this highly nutritious food to survive the long winters. Today, it remains a dietary staple for the Ojibwe people, as much medicine as it is food, with cultural and spiritual importance, and a necessary offering at community feasts and ceremonies. So I also want to add that wild rice is Minnesota's state grain, and that within present day Minnesota and Wisconsin and up in Canada, hand harvesting natural wild rice has also become an important cultural practice to non-tribal members. Okay. So I mentioned that wild rice is under stress. Research has estimated that there's been over Minnesota and Wisconsin, there's been about a 32% decline in wild rice abundance. And you can see here on the map on the right where wild rice was historically from the 1900s to 1995 in blue, and then the hash polygons is where wild rice is found more recently in the last couple of decades. So there's lots of stressors. We're wondering about many things, including commercial agricultural production. On the left, I just took a snapshot of a page that shows the corn for grain production in 2021 from NASS, and you can see here, there's some just visual correlation here about where we're losing wild rice and where the intense corn production is in our states. But those questions continue to be unanswered definitively, but we know there are some connections, and I can show you some more slides here. This comes from the 1854 Treaty Authority, which protects tribal rights to hunting and gathering, usufructuary rights in northeastern present-day Minnesota, on behalf of the Grand Portage National, the Grand Portage tribe, as well as the Bois Forte tribe. And you can see here data showing, and the nice thing about the data that we have from tribes is that they're longer time series, so we can look at trends over time in abundance and wild rice acreage, and you can see abundance in particular has declined, and some say also the quality of the rice has declined over time. And this is more local to you all. This comes from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, showing very similar patterns. Also, though, reductions in wild rice acreage, habitat acreage, and abundance in the last several decades. So what's causing the decline of wild rice and subsequently the decline of harvesting in the region? Lots of things. It's complex. We really need to rely on oral tradition and observations of tribal elders, tribal knowledge holders, and harvesters. The science isn't there, but we do know there are connections between land use change and the abundance of wild rice, concerns about deforestation, altered hydrology, commercial agriculture, and taconite mining. Climate change is a stressor, exacerbating many of the other impacts, including warming in general, and then specifically ice duration and depth in winters, and then extreme rain events in the spring when wild rice is particularly sensitive in its floating leaf stage. And then these cascading effects of water level changes, sedimentation and turbidity, competition and herbivory, and then loss or decline of supporting beings and processes like ash trees, fires, and beings like ducks and muskrats as well. And then there's concern, especially among tribal harvesters that we've talked to, about damaging harvesting practices, folks that go out too early, or folks that are harvesting in an unsustainable way, affecting the cycle, because wild rice is a annual plant, so it must reseed and grow every year. It's not a perennial, which makes harvesting really important to that process. So these are anthropogenic impacts, or maybe more accurately, the impacts of European colonization over this legacy since colonization, and those have both affected acreage, abundance, and we think quality. I like to think about also the harvesting as a proxy for understanding the decline in wild rice. And my apologies, I tried to make this a left to right chart, but you're gonna have to look at it right to left. So it starts in 1957 and goes through 2020, and these are wild rice harvester state license sales in Minnesota. These are predominantly almost all non-Indigenous folks. Non-Indigenous residents of Minnesota are required to buy a permit. If you are a tribal member, your tribal card counts as your permit to harvest. So this is just non-Indigenous harvesters, and you can see the sharp decline the end of the 80s in harvest in licensed sales. I did some very rudimentary just correlations to observe, like, well, what accounts for these patterns? Could it be drought? Could it be wet years, rain events? You can see variability in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but then in the 90s and beyond, that variability really flattens out. And, some of the economic factors have to do with the University of Minnesota actually producing a cultivated variety of wild rice. They began releasing this commercial paddy rice varieties in the late 1970s. And then by the late 1980s, 95% of the wild rice on the markets was paddy rice. So we had this big turnover in an emphasis and an understanding of naturally harvest or truly wild rice, and then this paddy rice really affecting the price of wild rice and really affecting the markets, which had, again, disproportionate impacts on tribal community members because of the decline in the prices of wild rice. So those are, thinking about some trends and stressors and also indicators of the decline. So we also know, and I've learned, that all relationships to Manoomin are important. How we come to know, value, and build relationships with Manoomin varies, but we all learn from Manoomin. So this is a chart that I put together. It's kind of busy, but I'm going to walk you through it. We conducted 2 mail surveys with harvesters, community members in the Lac du Flambeau band. They're up in north central present day Wisconsin, and then also those state harvesters in Minnesota. So we surveyed them and asked them questions about their harvesting practices, but also about the values and meanings of harvesting in wild rice. This shows the responses to a scale that asked for agreement with these statements, from strongly disagree on the left, which would be 1, which isn't showing because there were no 1s, to on the right, we have 5s, which is strongly agree. And so first of all, what I want to point out, I guess, is that the sample sizes are not consistent. We have far fewer Lac du Flambeau tribal harvesters because we surveyed tribal community members and then took a subsample for this analysis of folks who have harvested. That made our sample size much smaller. For the state harvester survey, since we were surveying harvesters, we had a higher sample to begin with. Let's look at the data. First of all, you can see there are many values, diverse values ascribed or assigned to wild rice. from, thinking about feeling that rice is a part of you, part of your identity, to enjoying eating wild rice, to understanding that wild rice is a healthful food source. So a lot of 4s to 5s, from moderately to strongly agree. And then if we look at the top ones, which are at the bottom, these are the highest rated overall by both the Lactaflambeau harvesters and the Minnesota State harvesters. We can see what sort of the 5 core values are. It's that wild rice tastes good. Wild rice is a healthful food source. It's important to a healthy natural ecosystem. And eating wild rice, natural wild rice, harvested by hand, is special to me. Those were the top 4 values, I should say, expressed by both sets of harvesters, both subgroups. But we also did some comparisons. And again, the sample sizes are not the same, but we can still draw some basic conclusions about statistical differences. And something that stuck out to me is that Minnesota State harvesters rated only 1 value higher than statistically higher than the Lactaflambeau harvesters, and that was enjoying eating wild rice. And I think that tells you something about just the value sets, the value orientations that the Minnesota State harvesters have. Not that Lactaflambeau tribal harvesters don't enjoy eating wild rice, but it wasn't significant in terms of when you do those comparisons. But if we look at the others, which values were statistically more had higher agreement with by the Lactaflambeau tribal harvester respondents than the Minnesota State harvester respondents, we see many. We see wild rice and wild rice waters needs better protection. Harvesting wild rice is a way for me to take care of the natural world. Harvesting wild rice brings my community closer together. So we see a deeper and maybe more diverse set of values that are significant to tribal harvesters, more so than to our Minnesota State non-tribal harvesters. Okay, that was a lot, but I think it's important to show some of the differences just for understanding. The other thing that we learned from the survey was a little bit about people's relationships with Manoomin. The Minnesota State or non-tribal harvesters, the median first harvested age was 34. Most folks said they learned how to harvest from a friend or on their own. And then we asked about, where do you get information now about harvesting? And the top responses with at least 20% or higher were from family or friends, or word of mouth from other harvesters. And then we also asked the same questions to the Lactaflambeau tribal harvesters, whose first harvesting year was much earlier. The median was 13. They learned from family members in school or from other community members like elders. And their top sources of information were different as well, with 20% or more saying they learned from a tribal natural resource agency, from family or friends, word of mouth from other harvesters, and tribal officials like rice chiefs. We were very excited because, that last question on a survey that says, what other comments can you share with us about wild rice or about the survey? For the Minnesota State harvesters, more than half the people that responded wrote in comments. That's how important wild rice is to them. And here's just kind of a snippet of that, a quote from a write-in on a survey. This respondent said, Minnesota wild rice harvested and processed right is the best tasting form of rice in the world. It must be protected. The other quote that came from a tribal harvester who responded to the survey was, we need wild rice. Without it, there's a space in my life that wouldn't sit right. Wild rice is with us from when we're born to our last dish when someone leaves the spirit world. It's a main food source for us. More help and more resources would help out the tribe and community more than you could think. So just some further, evidence and stories about the value of wild rice and harvesting. to harvesters. Another busy slide, but I'll walk you through it. I think this is the last slide I have on the survey efforts that we did with the 2 samples. We asked about what challenges or problems did you face in that previous harvest year. So for Lac du Flambeau harvesters, it was 2021, and for Minnesota State harvesters, it was 2018. You can see the 2 columns on the right. We had an even smaller sample size of Lac du Flambeau harvesters because there were fewer harvesters who had actually harvested in 2021. So that further reduced our sample size. But we did some non-parametric tests and found some differences in the statistical differences in the problems that were faced. All of these problems here that say SP, yeah, can you see my mouse? Okay, all the problems here that say SP are slight problems. So on a 5-point scale, these were low 2s on that scale, 1 being not a problem at all. And so there weren't major problems on average, but there definitely were major problems for some individuals. The shaded boxes are significantly different in terms of the differences between Lac du Flambeau and Minnesota State, the extent to which these were problems. And just at a glance, you can see here that on the left for Lac du Flambeau, there are many more problems or challenges faced using that non-parametric testing that we did. And then on the right, just a couple that were significantly, or just one actually, that was significantly higher for the Minnesota State harvesters. And that's high water levels. That happens to be because 2018 was a very wet year, and the water levels were very high, which affected the wild rice crop. And then interestingly, in 2021, it was an extremely low year. So while there was a pretty good crop of wild rice, it was difficult for folks to get out and access it. So that's what you see here. And then I'm particularly interested in issues around environmental justice and eco-economics. How are people able to access those benefits, and what inequities there might be among harvesters in terms of getting out? And several of these in purple here, you might consider more related to economics and environmental justice, like having time to go out harvesting. Too much harvester pressure, which means for tribes that are harvesting, and tribal members that are harvesting on reservation, there gets a lot of pressure on the fewer lakes that are on reservations, and then having to travel a long distance to find rice, issues of transportation. We know the financial costs. One of our tribal partners talked about the only Native Americans, the only indigenous people who are harvesting are middle class because it's expensive. And then some of these other with equipment and transportation. So those emerged to me and stuck out to me as ones to think about in terms of environmental justice and equities around economics, economic justice, and access. So the third lesson I wanted to share is that Manoomin teaches us about ourselves and our relationships with other beings. These are some students of mine and students on our project and some tribal elders at a tribal adaptation workshop hosted by Glyphwick. This was held in Duluth, in the Duluth area at Chambers Grove Park in June, just this past June. And we all learned together a lot about Manoomin and about relationships. So a few lessons in policy and management that Manoomin has taught me, and also that I've learned from the tribal knowledge holders that we've worked with. So natural growing wild rice is a vital food, medicine, and cultural resource. Harvesting and processing, actually, it's the whole process of coming together at a rice camp that's really significant, where you hand harvest and hand process the rice. It's central to community identity and food sovereignty. The tribal harvesters face many challenges in harvesting, as well as implicit and explicit environmental injustices. They're ones to do with how wild rice has been in decline in its abundance. So folks are having to travel farther. And there are also more implicit injustices in terms of rules and policies that don't support sustainable harvesting, like set harvest dates that are set by governments, state governments, rather than rice chiefs or tribal elders. And then harvesters from all walks of life are calling for better stewardship of wild rice, especially the non-native Minnesota state harvesters wanted better education and information sources. It didn't feel like the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources was prioritizing wild rice like it does other beings like trout, like deer. So they called for better stewardship and more attention to wild rice. Tribal nations, American Indian communities, and treaty organizations are actually leading the way in wild rice stewardship, restoration, and cultural learning programs. So many opportunities to listen and learn, and to have these experts guide the work that we're doing in habitat protection and water resource protection. And then, U.S. states and land-grant universities and the U.S. federal government have treaty responsibilities to protect and restore wild rice and to support tribal harvesting, part of those usufructuary rights that we need to honor. And for me, it's not just about having wild rice out there, but it's ensuring that access to wild rice, to healthy wild rice stands throughout the region. So that those inequities don't become bigger problems because of transportation needs. And then, as you know, treaties are nation-to-nation agreements between sovereign entities. These treaties, like the 1854 treaty, and others, they give tribal nations the right to hunt, fish, and gather. And though these treaties were authorized by the federal government, they are also the supreme law of the land. So state governments and local governments must honor and acknowledge those treaties as well. I just wanted to mention that we're working with many of the Ojibwe bands in the treaty areas on our Wild Rice Collaborative project in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and in Minnesota. And I'll just add a bit more about that relating to lessons in relationships that Manoomin has taught us. In terms of a scientist, learning about Manoomin has been so important because of the relationships I've developed with Manoomin and Manoomin knowledge holders. One quote from Jaji Gidnoding, who's a Red Lake Nation citizen, is that what we do to Manoomin, we do to ourselves. And so Manoomin is a great indicator and reflection of our own relationships with each other and with the natural environment. We've learned so much about collaboration with tribal partners, how important it is to walk the land together, to feast together, to engage in cultural exchange, also to acknowledge the past harms of science, and in particular, the University of Minnesota's wild rice breeding programs. We've also done a lot of work to reach out to young Native students and to hire students into our programs, because that has been so important especially for the tribal resource managers to work with, to know that next generation of experts is ready to act and ready to steward wild rice. The last couple of slides, I just wanted to show our kind of the depth and the breadth of our tribal university research collaborative here at the University of Minnesota. We've worked with many organizations, nonprofit organizations, many tribes, many intertribal organizations, and community members and students across cultures. And I would say for me, that's been one of the most valuable aspects of this relationship, is getting to know folks and learning so many different ways of knowing, so many different ways of being in relationship with Manoomin. And then some specific lessons for me in my own work, thinking about community-centered science. I started off by saying I'm an environmental social scientist, and I've always considered myself to be a participatory researcher doing community-based science. But it hasn't been until over the last 5 years where I've really understood what that means, what it means to be responsible, what it means to have reciprocal relationships in science. And that's really affected me in all the work I'm doing, whether it's working with urban communities in the Twin Cities, working with farmers and producers throughout the state of Minnesota, thinking about community members actually guiding and leading the research is so important. On the right, I have just a photo of an article that came out, I think in 2021, called Transforming Research and Relationships Through Collaborative Tribal University Partnerships on Manoomin. And that was a collaborative paper from this research that we've done together with several tribal members and scientists. And those principles, there's 10 principles there, really guiding my work and our work with tribes at the University of Minnesota. We have a new project I just wanted to pitch, which is we're looking at examining the relationships or pathways between agriculture, groundwater, and wild rice through different ways of observing the land and the waters. This project will primarily be in the Ottertail watershed, which is this area here. I'm just showing you a map with nitrate testing results, the red ones being exceeding standards in drinking water. And then there are a number of wild rice designated waters here as well. And so we're interested in understanding the link between agricultural land use change, groundwater impacts, especially nitrates, and how that might affect Manoomin ecosystems. Okay, and I think just to kind of recap, I wanted to share with you the lessons I've learned from Manoomin and from Manoomin knowledge holders, that Manoomin is a sacred relative under stress, that all relationships to Manoomin are important, and that we all have lots to learn from observing Manoomin, harvesting Manoomin, talking about it, asking questions, engaging with experts in storytelling and cultural exchange. And then just to close, I want to credit a lot of folks who helped put together parts of this presentation, especially Joe Gravine, who is the program manager. He's also a council member with Lac du Flambeau band and the Wild Rice Restoration Program. Peter David, maybe some of you know Peter. He has worked with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, Darren Vogt at 1854 Treaty Authority, and then a number of scientists and students at the University of Minnesota who are all part of the collaborative. Our funding has grown, or I should say evolved, maybe, not necessarily grown, but it started with an internal grant from the University of Minnesota that allowed us to spend the first year of our work just building relationships and listening to our tribal partners. And then it's expanded to an NSF coupled natural human systems grant and a NOAA climate adaptation sciences grant. And so we're just excited about keeping the momentum going. Our tribal partners are holding us to this work. They said this is a long-term relationship, it's not going to end with a funding cycle or a grant project end date, but that it's continuous. So we're working together to make that happen. Here's a picture of Jess and Anna at our big survey effort at Lac du Flambeau, and that's Joe there hiding behind the box. So thank you so much for your engagement and listening, and I'd love to have questions and dialogue or comments. or challenges to what I presented would be great. So thank you.
Appreciate it, Mae. It's good to hear about all the work you've been doing. I think when we last talked in person, this project was just getting off the ground, or was, I think, in the phase where you were meeting around, going around and kind of developing contacts.
Should I unshare my screen, or should I keep it up, or what would you...
Maybe hop off the screen share for the time being, and then if there's questions, maybe it's helpful, then you can maybe hop back on that.
Okay, I can look at the chat too.
There are some questions in the chat. If those folks who typed in questions in the chat want to just maybe raise their hand, their digital hand, and then maybe unmute and ask the question. I always think that's nice, rather than maybe having me just read. While people do that, maybe I'll go back and ask some questions that people have here. Let me look what we got in here. Kristen Dieterman asked, where are tribal nation Manoomin harvesters primarily harvesting? Within present day tribal nation reservation lands, outside present day tribal nation reservation lands, the Mississippi River Valley? ?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it all depends on the crop year to year. And so, ideally, the tribal harvesters would be harvesting right near home, right on their reservations. Their communities settled the area because of wild rice. Those are the settlement patterns, and they migrated, of course, for food. So ideally, it's right on the reservation lands, but they will travel to where the rice is. And so sometimes there are sort of lakes that are big producers of wild rice that are consistently harvested by tribal folks. But if those lakes are not abundant, then they'll move. Like this year, folks were moving sort of north and west into Minnesota, even from Lac du Flambeau area, because of the different patterns of where the crop was a good crop.
Hi, Mae. I have a question about harvesting and what was found with other species like sweetgrass, where the actual process of harvesting was integral to maintaining viability for the plant. And I've seen a practice of putting, rice back in, like reseeding essentially. And so has there been any research on that, of looking how management and harvesting is like cultivating essentially the habitat, and how that's leading to decline?
Yeah, I personally don't know a lot about the interactions between sort of stewardship and caretaking of the plant and the crop. But I have heard from our tribal partners and elders that there definitely are things that tribal harvesters are doing when they're out there to help ensure that the plant is reseeding. We've heard about binding wild rice into areas so that I'm not exactly sure why, but it could be to identify where folks can harvest and which clumps of the wild rice is ready for harvesting. There may be other relationships in terms of how to get in and around wild rice beds without damaging the plants. There have been stories told about historically harvesters also picking up certain plants that are competitive when they're out there. So not only harvesting the grain of the rice, but pulling maybe some other plants that they typically know is competitive. So for the next season, wild rice will have a better chance. There certainly has been lots of caretaking of wild rice and stewardship over the years.
Thank you.
I'm going to be an active participant here because I have a question for you, Mae, that I'm interested to hear about your experiences on. I was particularly interested in that slide you had very early on where you compared the Minnesota harvesters with the LDF harvesters and their difference in values for a resource. And I think of this relating to a lot of the work I'm currently doing around agricultural landscapes. There tends to be common care for a resource, like let's say water quality. Like a lot of people want improved water quality, but their perspective or values towards what is water quality or how to protect water quality don't necessarily align. I was wondering if you've had experience with, clearly there's both groups care about Manoomin, but they care about it in different ways. Have you tried to think about collaboration there or how that works, or respect at least for those differences in perspectives, or just if you have any insights on that?
Yeah, a project that I have right now that's ongoing in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and Kristen Bland at the Nature Conservancy. We're actually looking to sort of raise awareness and deepen people's understanding of wild rice as not just a tasty dish to serve at a family meal, but also very ecologically and culturally important and significant. We've done and supported rice camps and other sort of engagement opportunities for cultural exchange, where Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks can come together to share stories about wild rice, to talk about the traditional methods of harvesting, traditional methods of parching, jigging, winnowing rice, and to share those stories and sort of build that understanding, that cross-cultural dialogue, and just physically being together, doing something together is really important and really significant, I think, in bridging any gaps that exist, or more so than gaps, I think it's just deepening that understanding that's so important.
Kristen Dieterman, I see you got your hand up.
Oh, okay. I can unmute myself. Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, Kristen Dieterman. I work for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And my second question is kind of related to the first question. And it's just two of the maps you shared. So the one of historical presence and then kind of that nitrate integrated map shows significant impact in southern Minnesota, south central and southeast Minnesota more specifically. And I'm just wondering if there are any efforts in these areas, if you have any thoughts on that. Oftentimes we don't think about wild rice in these areas. So I just found that interesting.
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. Wild rice is sacred and important to the Dakota people as well. In southeastern present day Minnesota, we have worked somewhat with some of the Dakota tribes or Dakota communities to better understand the opportunities for restoration. Most of the wild rice in this area, it has been lost. And so we're thinking about why that is, if it's more about land use change, if it's more about pollutants, and also thinking about sort of how to raise that understanding. Many of the lakes around here are called rice lakes. I mean, there's clearly an oral tradition and legacy of the presence of wild rice and the impact of wild rice in southern Minnesota. And so raising attention, understanding where are good sources or where are good locations that are suitable for habitat restoration, for wild rice restorations. Prairie Island community has done a lot of work around restoration, raising understanding and raising awareness. So I think that agricultural interaction with wild rice will be really significant. Has to do with drainage, of course, has to do with the contaminants that come off of farms as well. Did you have a second question, Kristen, or was that both of your questions?
That was both of them, and it was in part related to the first question, but thank you so much.
Yeah.
There was a question in here, Mae, from Sandra Kosick Sills. I hope I'm saying your name right, Sandra. and she was wondering if there's any mapping or knowledge you know of around wild rice distribution in Ohio. I'm assuming that question maybe is getting at if there's been any disturbance to that wild rice population.
Yeah. I believe there's been some work that has showed a broader picture of the original ranges of wild rice and wild rice habitat. I know there are more efforts in Western Great Lakes, and Northwestern University has a research project that was just funded, a big scale research project to think about wild rice restoration as well. So I think there's a lot of momentum. A lot of tribal members from different tribes have talked about the loss of wild rice and how that's affected their culture, their language, their identity. It's affected youth, relationships and understanding of their culture. We work with leaders in Michigan who are, trying to bring that back, because Michigan's wild rice has been, almost depleted, but they're continuing to have rice camps and to tell that story and to share those lessons from Manoomin.
We have a comment here from Pete Huff. He's at Lake Manoomin in Menominee, Wisconsin. So that gets at the name, that part of creation of a place with the naming. I have a question. I have Amos Johnson has a hand up, and then I also have a question here from Carrie in the chat. So we'll go to Amos first and then Carrie.
Thank you. For private landowners who are interested in ecosystem restoration or habitat restoration on their own land, are there any resources geared specifically towards wild rice habitat restoration?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there has been an increasing interest by non-native folks, by landowners in Minnesota that I know of, interested in restoring habitat and possibly reseeding rice. That's something that is exciting, but also very much should come under the direction and the guidance of tribes for whom wild rice is sacred. So we've been pointing people to the tribes and intertribal organizations with those kinds of questions. There's very much care taken to the seed, the type of seed, where the seed's coming from, and where it's restored, because of the unique sort of varieties or tastes or colors and sizes of Zizania palustris or Manoomin. And so that's a careful process, and I would just encourage you to reach out to tribes nearby or to your treaty organization for insights on restoration.
Carrie, you have a question in the chat here. I'm wondering if you want to unmute and just ask it. If not, I can read.
I could. I wasn't sure if my microphone would work. How does the invasive species? So I'm a watercraft inspection supervisor out of Minnesota DNR. I was just kind of curious as to how the distribution of invasive species affects wild rice. Excuse me.
Thanks for that question, Carrie. So our partners call them non-local beings, and we think about invasive species or non-local beings as affecting the growth and abundance of wild rice. We know in particular, because wild rice is an annual plant and most of the other wetlands plants are perennial plants, that perennials can have an advantage. One of the key drivers, though, perhaps some research done by a PhD student named Mae Davenport is showing that not only the depth of the ice, but the duration of the ice over the winters is really important to sort of hitting the invasive plants, the perennials, back, and allowing an annual plant who is not affected by ice thickness and ice duration to thrive. So we think there are some connections. We've heard from oral tradition and harvesters that they've noticed that they've observed that relationship, and our science is only beginning to show some of those relationships as well. So that's been really interesting to think about the relationship between climate change, non-local beings, and wild rice.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Davenport here?
I do, and I'm really sorry to join late, but have you seen much use, or do you think there's potential to have more use of slow no wake and buoys to kind of section off areas for wild rice?
Yeah, we have heard many of our tribal resource managers have talked about the need for better control of motorized recreation, and also the behaviors of shoreland owners specifically. But there is concern about the wakes that boats and the jet skis can cause, especially in that spring in June during the floating leaf stage. The plants are very susceptible to wave action, to water level change, and being just cut off from motors. And of course, if you know, and if you have a shoreland cabin or property, there's a lot of concern about the removal of plants, native plants in wild rice that are affected by that removal process as well, for swimming or for fishing or for boating. So those are a couple of human impacts that our tribal managers are asking for better policies.
There's a question here from Michael Swinson. I'm wondering if you want to go ahead and just ask that.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Michael's asking, have the communities that we've talked to mentioned that groundwater is important to wild rice? And absolutely, this new project that I mentioned at the end, funded by the University of Minnesota Institute on the Environment. We're partnering with Red Lake Nation citizen and to understand the influence of agriculture and groundwater contamination, which we can see in areas of north central Minnesota through drinking water testing, that there are nitrates that are contaminating, exceeding levels of standards. And so we're really interested in understanding that groundwater pathway to Manoomin. Our tribal partner, as I said, Jajigid Noting has said, groundwater is surface water, is groundwater in these watersheds because of those just tight connections. So we know that groundwater could play a role. We know it plays a role in terms of flow, but we're thinking also that maybe chemistry can be a factor, especially we've talked about the early spring flushes of pollutants and from snowmelt, of agricultural runoff and things like that. Testing groundwater early in the spring could be really, really important.
We have a question here from Linda, and maybe I could add to her question a little bit. Linda, one thing I plan on doing with Dr. Davenport is following up with maybe for her to share her slide deck, and then also if she could, I can get the PDF for that citation and put it up on our website so they could be found there. But if we could also maybe, Mae, could you maybe elaborate on some of those? I think you mentioned 10 principles around collaborative research that kind of came out. Could you maybe elaborate on some of that?
Yeah, for sure. So, we talked about sort of in year 3 of working together, we realized that we had some principles that sort of emerged as being just fundamental to the relationship and the contract that we had with our tribal partners, many of whom signed memoranda of understanding. And so, some of those include like being on the path together, that in research, The conventional sort of Western science approach is that there are scientists who are experts who are extracting knowledge and making observations and then delivering results, delivering outcomes. So we're trying to challenge that assumption, to shift the power dynamics, and to make sure that in research we're on the path together, towards identifying study areas, research questions, methodologies. We do a lot of that sharing together. So that's one of the big ones. And then I can actually some of the other principles that are really important include sort of providing and understanding like what is responsible research and how to understand the cultural differences and cultural understanding of research. So in some cases, we do a lot of gifting. We start our conferences with prayers and blessings. We have drummers attend. When our researchers are out in the water, they will give tobacco or sema offerings, not because we think as scientists that that's a way to do research, but because we've been asked by our partners to do those things and to honor those traditions. I mentioned this, but addressing past and present harms has been an essential part of our relationships. In the first year or so, in the relationship building and getting to know each other, we were asked that question about what the University of Minnesota is doing in its genetic research at the start of many of our conversations. And we had to accept that and talk about it and be open about acknowledging that harm and to be clear about how this research was different and how we would honor tribal sovereignty and data sovereignty and not do any genetic research or manipulation or any collection of samples without tribal approval. So those are some of the principles. And then the paper is supposed to be open access, so we should be able to share that.
Great. Linda, Mae, when we follow up, let's maybe make sure to put that up so people like Linda can access that information you guys have compiled from your experience. It looks like Lisa Cusick has her hand up here.
Hi again. I am just curious about the evolution of this relationship between plant breeding and the nations. And I was at University of Minnesota in the early 2000s. Got to see a lot of that unfold. And so, I mean, is there anything that has happened that can be a collaboration in terms of genetics and tribal nations and people? Like, is it just a divide, I guess, now is my question.
Yeah, great question. Very complex. There is not one voice from tribes on this issue. Each, sovereign nation and individual tribal nation has different perspectives. But the Minnesota Indian Affairs Committee has come out and asked the University of Minnesota to stop its genetic research and breeding research on wild rice. And that's been clear for actually, more than a decade. And so the University of Minnesota is grappling with that. Our new president, new in the last 5 years, president has committed herself to listening to tribes. She has a new advisor on tribal affairs. That's a new position. Our new position in our department, we have a tribal natural resource management faculty member, Michael Dockery. That was a new position. And our research model is really being held up as an example of how to do it right. But we still have a breeding program at the University of Minnesota. And that is just a constant concern and worry among our tribal partners, and a challenge for us to make sure that we're not associating directly with that work, and how to explain that and how to talk about that in an open way and be transparent is just critical.
Thanks so much, Mae. Appreciate it.
Frank Nelson, I see you got your hand up.
Yes, thanks for the presentation today. And I guess my question is, with your discussions around Manoomin, you also discuss other wetland plants that likely have significant cultural, nutritional, and medicinal value among the indigenous tribes, but have, largely been overlooked with Western science. And, we typically think of, well, these are plants for wildlife, as opposed to, the fact that they are quite edible and have this cultural history.
Yes, absolutely. There are the tribes here in Minnesota that I know are leading the way on this. Our Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe they have an aquatic ecologist, plant ecologist, who's really studying those interactions between wild rice and other aquatic plant beings, and watching those over time. But absolutely, there are so many cultural plants that are significant to not only as food, but medicine and ceremony. And those are all, there's concern about the threat of climate change and among other anthropogenic changes. But so there's a lot of attention and a lot of science and oral history and knowledge that are coming to the table to try to better understand those interactions and decide how to be good stewards of those interactions.
There's a question in the chat here from Pete Huff. Pete, I'm wondering if you can just go ahead and ask it.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and really appreciate the presentation. Just a question around just the placement of dams and the impact on habitat. And, I mentioned earlier, I live on a lake that has a dam first for timber staging and then later electricity generation, which is perpetually in water quality distress as a result of that decision and many other decisions. And I'm just curious about how dam placement, both those are historic, how that conversation is dealt with when it comes to habitat restoration, if it is at all. I know it's a sensitive subject on certain dams, but not all of them may be needed as much anymore. I'm curious if that could be commented on.
Yeah, well, I'm a social scientist, so when I start to talk about hydrology and hydraulics, I want to make that clear. But what I've heard from the hydrologists, the tribal and university hydrologists that I've talked to, is that it is an important relationship, that water levels and drainage really affect wild rice. And that historically, of course, the alteration of that natural hydrology of wild rice ecosystems has been a negative impact. But over time, there's sort of adaptations. Much of central Minnesota and north central Minnesota was drained for agriculture, even though it wasn't good for agriculture, at least not crop production. And so we have a lot of that channelization in these ditches. The Fond du Lac tribe, and Nancy Schultz talks about this, they've been sort of using those features to control and actually buffer some of the big storm events and droughts and things like that. So they are being used in some cases now to an advantage, but only because of the precarious situation that wild rice has been put in by those kinds of practices. So there are some instances where now at our present day and in current conditions that dams and water control structures are helping wild rice make it through season to season.
Are there any additional questions for Dr. Davenport?
There's a few more really good comments from Linda Storm.
Yeah, I think there seems to be a connection, Linda, with your work here. It seems like in the Pacific Northwest, so definitely seems like a chance to follow up. One of the things, Mae, we've noticed from these digital dialogues is we get an audience from really all over the United States and even beyond the United States. So it's been kind of fun to see that happen, and it's fun to see the connection of all these projects around land use decision making and collaboration and different knowledge frameworks and things like that. Ben, I see you came off mute screen, so I feel like you have another question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not good at raising my hand for some reason, but yeah, I'm a big wild rice advocate, love it. Wondering how can we get some better collaboration, at least in Wisconsin, between the tribes, the DNR. I think the counties, like county land conservation, are often an overlooked partner. As we talked about dams, it's often municipalities and counties that are control of those dams. And so obviously water levels, they literally have control over them at times. So they can be an effective partner, and they're also involved with invasive species. How do we pull it all together? And I would assume Ducks Unlimited just would want to throw money towards these efforts endlessly. How do we do it? How can I help?
Well, that sounds like more of a question for other folks on the call. Maybe I'll just turn that back around. I know that the tribes have been working very closely, and it's not always been positive, but have had conversations about what is consultation, what is meaningful consultation. In fact, we put together a little research summary based on interviews we did about consultation with state agencies, and what makes it meaningful and what makes it not so meaningful. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear about what others might say about that question. How can we collaborate better, especially in Wisconsin?
I think one thing in my experience, I've had conversations with Joe Gravine. I'm actually kind of right now, I'm currently in Vilas County just by Lac du Flambeau's. I'm on their ceded territory actually. It was an interesting conversation around Joe Gravine, because when I started talking about resource management, my focus was on walleye populations and what could be done to provide habitat for that. And he was kind of like, yeah, I'm worried about walleyes, but I'm really worried about wild rice. And so just his perspective on the resource was different than my framing, just because of my worldview. And so I think just having those dialogues of what is important aspects of the resource, and how management could prioritize those. I think Mae, you brought up that like Minnesota DNR was prioritizing things like deer, and I forget the other one you brought up, but those tend to be what a lot of people maybe think about when it comes to like hunting or fishing, but maybe doesn't consider other perspectives of the resource. And so I think at least that conversation I had with Joe, and that was about 4 or 5 years ago, was pretty eye-opening to me, and changed my perspective about the wild rice up here. And I viewed it differently than just being habitat for mallards come duck season. So that was eye-opening.
That's a really good point, John. And I think part of it is just humility and moving over and letting tribes who have capacity, in many ways to lead these discussions, to lead policy making, and just moving over, I think is just critical, because there's no way to understand. I think from my perspective, I continue to learn about Manoomin every day, that I'm working with the tribal folks that we work with. And those lessons and that insight is so important. And it's about relationships. It's about collaboration. It's not just about protecting a species, but what we do to wild rice, we do to ourselves. And that worldview, I think, is something that can really sort of be the leading way of thinking about how to collaborate, how to work together, and how to honor tribal sovereignty and protect wild rice. I see Linda has a hand up.
Hey, thank you. So I'm wondering, one of the core things that we're working on in having some guiding principles for cultural sensitivity in Indigenous and non-Indigenous collaborations is, so we're trying to articulate some key principles that are sometimes hard to articulate because of what you pointed out. It's very important is that there's not one voice that can represent all tribal nations or all tribal entities and Indigenous groups that would, for example, be using Manoomin or have a relationship, a sacred relationship to Manoomin or to Canis. And one of the things that I'm really seeking more guidance on, both from our tribal partners, but also anything else that are examples that have been developed in terms of collaborative research, are in that situation where you have a spectrum of tribal concerns and different relationships. What is sacred in one instance may not be sacred in another instance. And so that gets complicated really fast. And so can you speak to that maybe a little bit, given what Manoomin being a sacred plant, it's a relative, it's part of a whole community that has, oral history and tradition that's connected to place.
Yeah.
Have you guys struggled with that?
We have, I mean, we're outsiders. I'm an outsider to the communities in which we're partnering with. And so I came into, and many of our scientists from our team, we came into the project and we wrote the original proposal. We had some tribal partners on the proposal, but we knew right away it wasn't enough. There is no one voice for tribal nations. Even within nations, you have tribal communities and you have the tribal government. You have elders and chiefs who may have different perspectives to share and experiences to share. But we came in with a focus on sulfate and sulfide as a contaminant, a water contaminant, and impacting wild rice. And we walked into, some of these elder lunches and tribal council meetings, and we were told, yeah, that's something maybe, but what we are more worried about is our communities and water and our drinking water, and water as sort of the fundamental resource or gift that we have to protect, and that wild rice depends on water. And then they started to list all of these relationships that were important to understanding impacts to wild rice, and sulfide wasn't on the list. So we had to, backtrack a bit and rethink our approach. And we knew that we shouldn't come in with a question or even a specific topic, that we needed to come in with the message that we are honoring tribal sovereignty, that we know that wild rice is sacred. We have a team of researchers with these expertise. How can we support the work that you're doing? And not to pretend like that work isn't already happening in a very, deep and intense way. So we were listeners for the first year and a half. We continue to listen. We get feedback. We have continuous evaluation that we do to check ourselves and to check our relationship. And we've made mistakes. And I think we have a relationship though where our partners are willing and patient to point us in the right direction and to correct us when we make mistakes. But we definitely went to cultural trainings led by some of our partners. We had, advisors and folks that continued to teach us and to help us, weave our different knowledges together.
Thank you so much.
Linda, nitrogen, not when?
Win.
Win.
Win. Yep. Win. So bonjour everybody. I'm the environmental director for Red Cliff Band of Lakes Superior Chippewa, which is located in northern Wisconsin. So going back to the collaboration, or trying to figure out platforms where Manoomin is being discussed and talked about, we do have, I believe it's a quarterly call that the BIA is facilitating, but every call is led by a different tribal affiliation. So we have, Minnesota and Wisconsin tribes on this call, as well as 1854 Treaty Authority. May, I don't know if you were aware of that call at all? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so just to put that out there, it may be an avenue to tap into especially outreach to, there's a lot more Wisconsin tribes on that call as well.
And what was it, Linda, the name of that? You said the BIA, is there a name for the program or the collaborative that brings people together?
I don't think there's officially,
Okay,
it was kind of just thrown together because I think there was a lot of Manoomin grants that were being
Mhm.
applied for either through
Yeah.
Circle of Flight or JLRI.
yeah,
And I think everybody thought it would just be a good idea for tribes to get together and talk about what we're doing, and then to also bring in outside speakers to highlight, you know, off-reservation efforts or from a different organization. So.
thank you, Linda.
All right, if there's one more question, we probably have time for about one more. If not, we can maybe adjourn here. I'll give people a chance though to.
Just a quick comment for folks' awareness. There is actually under NRCS equip, there is a line item for wild rice seeding. To be cost shared, I think it's greatly underutilized, but it is in the equip cookbook through NRCS. And in my experience, any reseeding effort, and there is guidance through USDA NRCS on wild rice seeding. And in my experience, you have to commit to seeding at least 3 years in a row and commit to trapping muskrats very aggressively.
Well, if there's no more questions, I appreciate the lively dialogue, and May, I appreciate putting together the presentation. It's great to hear about the work you're doing. I can't help but think about the project you're doing there in North Central Minnesota. One of our learning hubs on this Grassland 2.0 project's right in that area, and we're very focused on water quality and agriculture and its impact on the environment. And so I can't help but think maybe there's chances for collaboration there. So let's
Absolutely.
stay in touch on that, and your insights would be helpful to our effort. So I appreciate this. In 2 weeks, we have our last digital dialogue. We are still kind of pulling together the speaker. We have a speaker in mind. Plan on talking to them on Thursday, so we'll have more updates in the coming days, and we'll also follow up with Dr. Davenport about putting together maybe sharing the slide deck, and then also some of those publications you referenced that it seems like there is a want to look at those and draw insights on that. So I appreciate that. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day, and look forward to seeing everyone in a couple weeks.